and welcome to another episode in our historical series, The Good, the Bad, and the Tyrannical. I'm your host, Sophie Balchin. Today we have travelled to Tudor England in the mid-1500s and are looking to answer the question, was Henry VIII a tyrant, or has history and popular culture warped his image into that of a man whose reign was drenched in the blood of his opponents? But how do we define what makes a tyrant? Well, we use Maurice Leighty's definition, a ruler who exercises arbitrary power beyond the scope permitted by the laws, customs and standards of his time and society, and who does so with a view to maintaining or increasing that power. To help us figure this out, we have gathered members of the king's own family and court, both living and dead, to get an insider's view into what was actually happening. Okay then, our first guest is the woman at the start of it all, Henry's first Queen of England, the Princess of Aragon and Castile, beloved by the people and a devout Catholic wife. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Catherine of Aragon.
Thank you for having me. It's an honour to be here.
Now, Catherine, you were married to Henry in 1509 for 24 years. You'd known him for even longer with your prior marriage to his brother Arthur. You had your daughter Mary together, and yet things started to fall apart. Can you explain to our audience what you think happened?
I loved my husband very much. I did everything I could to please him after he made me his queen, but sadly I could not give him the one thing he desired above all else, a son, and so he turned to the arms of another woman.
Let's talk about Arthur, your first husband, and how that was later used against you in Henry's quest for a divorce.
This is true, yes. In Leviticus in the Bible it says that a man who uncovers his brother's nakedness through marriage to his widow will be left childless. Henry believed he was breaking divine law by remaining married to me, and others told him that I was lying when I said that I was still a virgin and my first marriage had not been consummated. He chose to side with them.
The big question we have to ask here, Catherine, is, with all things considered, do you think Henry was a tyrant?
No, of course I do not think that my husband was a tyrant. Though I do not agree with his actions and his turning against the faith, I loved him and always will. In the last letter I wrote to Henry, I made a vow, mine eyes desire you above all things. He still took care of me after our divorce with a pension and a house with staff, and ensured the safety of our daughter. For that I will always be grateful.
You mentioned that he turned to another woman. You're of course referring to Anne Boleyn.
She was one of the ladies in my service at court, and yet she betrayed my trust and seduced my husband.
Well, many do see her that way, but we'll see what our audience think. Our next guest has a mixed reputation. A queen, a mother, an ambitious woman, but also a witch, a whore, and an incestuous traitor? It's for you to decide. Please welcome Anne Boleyn. Anne, thank you for being here. I believe you know Catherine.
We are acquainted.
If that's what you want to call it.
Let's get back on track. Anne, can you tell us about the Henry VIII that you knew and fell in love with?
When our relationship first began in 1526, Henry wrote me dozens of love letters, often ending them with, "Written with the hand of him that longeth be yours." He yearned to have me beside him at court and made sure I had every reminder of his affections. Only once we were together, particularly towards the end of our marriage, did Henry's behaviour towards me change.
The modern television show The Tudors by Michael Hirst has painted quite a graphically passionate relationship between the two of you, especially in comparison to Catherine, who is portrayed as older and a shackle weighing the king down. How much of this would you say is fantasy compared to fact?
This is again ridiculous. While I may have been older than Henry, our relationship was founded on mutual trust and respect. I was the princess of a powerful nation and had learned how to rule from my parents, Ferdinand and Isabella. The king knew this and even left me in charge of the country for some time, whilst he was at war with France. In his absence I commanded England's remaining army to a great victory against Scotland. Though my age may have become a factor when it meant I could no longer bear children, it was only at that time that our problems began. Even then I would not call him a tyrant.
Everyone at court knew about the issues between the king and queen. It was something that I took advantage of. To gain Henry's interest, I refused his advances and returned the gifts that he sent, acting as no other woman would dare, until he was mine. But it was my greatest shame that I too could not give him a son. So after all the religious upheaval he had put the country through on my behalf, I think what had once been passion turned into something darker.
For our audience, Anne is referring to the break with Rome, when Henry formally left the Catholic Church and began the Church of England, making the country Protestant for the first time ever, although his stance on religion has been debated. Do you then feel a sense of responsibility for everything that followed, Anne?
I cannot deny that I had goals and aspirations. Perhaps it was this that drove us apart. But I did not deserve the slanderous accusations he laid against me. To believe the confessions of men that were extracted under torture is madness. To believe that I had intimate relations with my brother is pure insanity. To know that my once loving husband was behind it all is when I started to believe that he was capable of tyranny, and this was confirmed in my execution in 1536.
Well, there we have it. Two of the women who were closest to the king believing that Henry was not always a tyrant, but that he was showing more of an inclination in later years. Our next guest had every reason to believe Henry VIII was a tyrant, yet while alive he did not see the king in this way. Perhaps his execution has changed that. Please welcome to the panel the leader of the Pilgrimage of Grace, Mr. Robert Ask. Robert, thank you for being here. Firstly, could you explain to our audience who might not know, what exactly was the Pilgrimage of Grace?
The pilgrimage was an uprising in the north with 40,000 plus members. I prefer not to say rebellion, more a mass protest of the closing of the smaller Catholic monasteries in the country, and that England had broken with Rome to become Protestant.
You say this was not a rebellion, but modern history counts it as the largest Tudor uprising directed against any of the monarchs. Was your aim to overthrow the power of the king?
No, this is not the case at all. We all had to swear an oath, the heart of which was to the preservation of the king's person and his issue, to the purifying of the nobility, and to expulse all villain blood and evil counsellors against the Commonwealth from his grace. We believed that the king was being led astray by his advisers, the ones who were naming us heretics. There was never a plan to unseat him from the throne, only to the protection of his person and the true faith. I did not think he was a tyrant then.
You may not have meant to harm Henry, but he seemed to have designs against you.
Our numbers did far outweigh that of the king's army. Had it come to a battle, he would have lost, and I think he was well aware of that.
So you suspect that with this knowledge, Henry invited you to meet him under the guise of a truce, but with no intentions of making peace. Would you say this changes your opinion about him not being a tyrant, considering that England has essentially been a Protestant nation ever since?
Had it been that the country had fully converted to Protestantism, and had we been violent in our actions, then yes, the king would have had every right to execute myself and my fellow leaders as heretics. But the truth is, we were not acting in defiance. Catholicism was still the primary religion at that time. Henry's actions were far too harsh, and therefore that of a tyrant.
Well, Robert, thank you for coming in today and sharing your side of the story. We'll see how that sways our audience. Now for some foreign perspective. This man served as imperial ambassador to England on behalf of Charles V, King of Spain. He saw the inner social and political workings of the court and witnessed the actions of Henry himself. Joining us now is Eustace Chapuis.
Thank you for having me.
You were an ambassador in England for just over 15 years, and in that time you saw some of the most dramatic changes the country would ever face under Henry VIII.
It was a terrible time for Catholics in England. I was requested specifically by Catherine of Aragon to defend her against the king. She had the full support of Spain behind her once her nephew Charles V took the throne. After I failed her, I made certain of the safety of her daughter, Melanie.
With your close personal connection to the royal family, what impression did you get of Henry himself?
Every step he took seemed to be one for his own benefit. It did not seem as though he was concerned with the suffering he inflicted upon his people with the religious change, or how he failed to help them in their times of need with famine or rebellion.
This was all information you relayed back to Charles.
It was my job to reliably inform the king of the goings-on in England. I reported back what I saw.
And what is it that you saw in Henry?
I saw that he was a tyrant, and was unafraid to make that known in my reports. In a letter I sent to Charles in 1535, I wrote, "While the people is provoked by the great cruelties daily committed, and the worse and tyrannical extortions practised on churchmen, the expulsion of monks and nuns from their cloisters, and most of all the famine which threatens to prevail in consequence of the bad harvest, all which is imputed to bad life and tyranny of the king."
Do you believe that Henry's character was entirely unredeemable?
He had his moments, and I know that he did come to treat Mary fairly and with love, but many of his choices were selfish and against the service of his people.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts today. Eustace Chapuis, everybody. . Whereas Chapuis saw much of the bad, our next guests all started out with a belief in Henry's goodness, but life and events saw some change. Please show a warm welcome to the three Thomases, Wolsey, Cromwell and More.
Hello, thank you for having us.
You were all quite close to Henry at some time. Thomas Wolsey, a cardinal, an archbishop, and the Lord Chancellor. Thomas More, you were a councillor and the next Lord Chancellor. And Thomas Cromwell, the Earl of Essex and Henry's chief minister. But 2 out of 3 of you were executed, and Wolsey, you only managed to escape the same fate due to your natural death. Can you explain to our audience what you think happened that turned you from some of the most influential men in the country to enemies of the crown? Yes, Mr. More.
Well, speaking on behalf of myself and the Cardinal, I would say the biggest contributing factor was our faith. I was and always had been a devout Catholic. When I refused to acknowledge his annulment to Catherine and swear an oath to him as supreme head of the Church of England, my fate was sealed even before my trial. It was inevitable that I would be declared a traitor and executed. As I once said, serving the king was like having fun with tamed lions. Often he roars for no reason, and the fun becomes fatal.
I agree with Mr. More. As a Chancellor, I had a duty to my king and country, but as a Cardinal, I was appointed by the Pope to serve God and the Catholic Church. Still, this was not the path I chose. I tried to serve the king above God, but failed to negotiate an annulment for him that would maintain his relationship with the Church. Power was my downfall, and it saw me stripped of my titles and living in virtual exile in New York. Still, the king was stubborn. What matter ye put into his head, for ye shall never pull it out again.
Would the two of you say that Henry was a tyrant?
Without a doubt, though he was once my good friend, Henry acted unjustly and without cause against the Catholics of this nation. He took a somewhat stable realm and had it descend into a state of disunity and rebellion.
I couldn't agree more. The religious change and the changes to the court left him vulnerable and easily manipulated by enemies of the true faith.
Thank you. Now, Thomas Cromwell, you have a slightly different perspective as one of the men driving the English Reformation. You helped secure the king's annulment by encouraging his title of supreme head, which allowed him to enact his own divorce. To an extent, you were the man who gave him everything he wanted. What changed?
In my rise to power, I made many enemies. I turned on those who were once my allies.
Are you talking about Anne Boleyn?
I helped Anne get to the place she wanted to be, but above all else, I served the king, and when he no longer wanted her around, I gathered the necessary information that would see her removed. Perhaps it was not the most moral of actions, but it was an action I was required to take.
So it was the surviving enemies that you had made along the way that brought you down?
They were a factor, yes. I had Henry banish them from court, but when they returned, it was with an obvious grudge and intent to see me either exiled or killed. My other mistake was Anne of Cleves. The Reformation was essential to England, and I could think of no better way to consolidate it than with an alliance through marriage to a German Lutheran princess.
For our audience, Lutheranism was many of the key principles upon which Protestantism and the Reformation was built. In the 1500s, the German states were mostly Lutheran, unlike the major powers such as France, Spain, and previously England, which were Catholic.
I couldn't have known that Henry wouldn't take to Anne. My fall came quickly after that, and I was arrested and executed on accounts of treason and heresy.
Knowing what you know, and how the rest of Henry's reign unfolded, would you call him a tyrant?
I could not say that I am particularly inclined towards one way or another. As a Protestant myself, I did not see his actions as tyrannical, but obviously, in the eyes of the Catholics, this was not the case. Though I do hold some blame for my own fall from grace, Henry was quick to change his opinions, and his ministers could live or die by the mood of the day. This is coinciding with the traits of a tyrant, but we must take responsibility for our own shortcomings to both our king and country.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you all for coming in. Coming up next, we're talking to another group of men, but this time from outside of England, all the way from Rome, Pope Clement VII and Cardinal Campeggio. Hello.
Hello.
Your Holiness, you were head of the Catholic Church during the time in which Henry VIII was looking to get a divorce, is that correct?
Yes, it was a sad time for us. After my predecessor, Leo X, named him Defender of the Faith, to have him turn his back on us in such a manner was terrible.
What did it mean to be Defender of the Faith?
We had written a book defending the 7 sacraments and the supremacy of the Pope. which was stating his opposition to the Protestant Reformation and his loyalty to Catholicism. This was why he was granted the title, but it was of course later revoked, and he was excommunicated for his betrayal of Rome. I saw it as the destruction of Christendom. I could not satisfy the king's wish without offending my own conscience.
Cardinal Campeggio, you actually visited Henry's court in 1529 as a judge to decide whether there was legitimate cause for an annulment to his marriage with Catherine of Aragon.
The Pope sent me as his representative to report back what I had learned. What I saw was true and honest woman, making a great plea before God and her husband, in a language that was not her mother tongue, consigning herself to the justice of the Lord.
You recounted her speech, which opened with,
Sir, I beseech you for all the love that hath been between us, and for the love of God, let me have justice. Take of me some pity and compassion, for I am a poor woman, and a stranger born out of your dominion.
She was a woman of good faith, and her family had always been loyal to the Pope. I could see that she loved the king despite all that he was putting her through.
With all this in mind, would you call Henry a tyrant?
Henry seized a power that was not his to take. He took unlawful action against a woman who had done him no wrong, and then to further the insult, he closes our monasteries and forces priests into hiding. If this is not the action of a tyrant, then I don't know what is.
I agree. Henry acted as no monarch had. God will judge him for his actions, which are those of a tyrant.
Some conclusive statements there. Thank you both for coming in today. Now, we've heard from his wives, we've heard from his ministers, and we've heard from the Catholics he was going against. Now I think it's time to hear from the man himself. Ladies and gentlemen, His Majesty, King Henry VIII. So Henry, you've heard what everyone has had to say so far, and it's a mixed bag of yes, you were a tyrant, and no, you weren't, with some being on the fence and saying you descended into tyranny. What do you have to say to these allegations?
I am disgusted that such slander should even be put to my name. Is this the kind of respect people have for their king?
So you disagree with those who are calling you a tyrant?
I have a divine right to rule as the monarch of this land. God chose and anointed me to safeguard the realm, and I will answer only to him.
The question for many people, though, Your Majesty, is that are you answering to a Catholic or a Protestant God? Could you not see how the break with Rome may look like the work of a tyrant to those of the Catholic faith?
It is true that I once defended Catholicism against the influx of Lutheran belief, and that some men who remained of that faith were my good friends. The loss of More and Cromwell was a great grievance to me, but they failed me at the time I needed them the most. The opportunity to remain in my good graces was presented to them both. However, failure to comply meant that I had no other choice. A king cannot show leniency to traitors, even if they were once his friends. This is not tyranny, it is being a good ruler. The Reformation was far greater than any one man. It was the future for England and English greatness. It saw the Bible brought to the common people in a language that they understood, and was the foundation for the continuation of the Tudor dynasty.
Dynasty was highly important to you, I know. But as you may have heard, some could use it as an argument against you, particularly when it comes to your wives.
My wives and I had a purpose to fulfill, to produce a strong male heir who could rule the nation after I had passed. I did my part in that matter, but they failed in theirs. Any nobleman, earl, or lord with the duty of continuing a line would have considered the same options that I did, would have known the pressure and the shame of not having a son. But it is my life that the population was privy to, and thus my actions that they are called tyrannical. Is it an act of tyranny to find a solution to a problem that affects the entirety of the country? England needed a queen and a male heir. If one woman could not fulfill this, then is there any true wrong in finding another who can?
So are you saying it wasn't personal, merely business between yourself, Catherine and Anne?
I held affection for them both at some time. I composed great works of poetry and music in their honour, still neither one gave me a son. I loved Mary and Elizabeth very much. My daughters were the pearls of my world, but England needed a king to rule, it as so many had before.
For many years, though, Elizabeth was the longest reigning monarch in this country's history, and a rather successful one at that. If there was some way of you knowing this, would you have changed anything, perhaps stayed married to one of your first two wives?
It is a joy to me knowing of Elizabeth's success, but I was raised on the fact, as everyone was, that one needed a male heir to rule. The pursuit of a son is not the action of a tyrant, it's the action of a man.
I want to talk to you about popular culture. The actor who portrayed you on the television series The Tudors, Jonathan Rhys-Meyers, did an interview discussing his opinion on your life. He said that while you had acted selfishly and out of a carnal desire by marrying Anne Boleyn, your relationships were also a matter of state and politics. That it must have been hard to be human when you can't properly show your emotions as the spiritual leader of the country.
This man speaks some truth. As a king, I cannot afford to show my weakness in any aspect of my life, personal or political. I cannot show leniency to those who have failed me, and as I have said, this is sadly true for both Catherine and Anne.
So you hold firm to the belief that your reign was successful. There are no changes you would make if you could turn back time.
It is my belief that, of all losses, time is the most irrecoverable, which can never be redeemed. I wanted to create a great legacy that will forever be remembered, in a time with no end. When I look back at my time, I created much good. I fortified our coast, I created a powerful navy. My court was filled with a splendour and opulence that rivaled that of my European counterparts. I even changed the face of English religion forever. Does this not make me a great king? I do regret how many of my relationships may have ended, but I acted justly and in the name of the true faith. Rebels were put down where heresy arose, ties were cut with those who failed their king and country, progress was made where progress was needed. You may see me as a tyrant, but you are wrong.
Thank you so much to His Majesty King Henry VIII. As we are drawing to the end of the show, our last matter of business is to get our in-studio audience's final decision. Vote now. Yes, Henry was a tyrant. No, he wasn't. Or that he descended into tyranny. The results are in. 12% of our audience has voted for no, Henry VIII wasn't a tyrant. 25% have said that yes, he was, and the resounding majority at 63% voted for Henry having descended into tyranny. Well, there you have it. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's panel, and we'll catch you next week where we'll be going back to ancient Rome and talking to Emperor Nero. This has been The Good, the Bad and the Tyrannical. Thank you, and good night.